Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Julia Friedlander. I'm the C. Boyden Gray Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Geoeconomics Center here at the Atlantic Council. And I am joined today by Jonathan Lang, who's the Director for Trade and Supply Chains at the Eurasia Group. And we're going to moderate together a discussion on supply chain security and broader efforts at crafting an effective industrial policy in the wake of COVID economic disruption and, of course, growing tensions with China over key resources and technologies. This topic was front and center at the G7 and the US-EU summits, the latter culminating in the launch of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which we've heard a lot about. So these efforts are inherently transatlantic. While the US has just completed its supply chain review, the European Commission is hard at work on comprehensive legislation to the same ends. Yesterday, the Atlantic Council had the honor of welcoming Brian Deese, the director of the National Economic Council, to present the White House's vision in 5 pillars to help achieve resilience and stability in areas where, in his words, markets cannot do enough. We'd be remiss if we didn't note that negotiations are also hot and live on the Hill right now over the US Innovation and Competition Act. So this is a live wire. I am really excited to introduce our distinguished panel today to help unpack yesterday's remarks and as well as the strategies for supply chains that have emerged on both sides of the Atlantic. So we can talk about both benefits and potential pitfalls. Because frankly, once we have strategies in place, we have to implement them. So without further ado, with me today are Jimmy Goodrich, Vice President, Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association, John Murphy, Senior Vice President for International Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and Maiva Rutte, Deputy Director General for Internal Market, Industry and Entrepreneurship and SMEs at the European Commission. So really a wonderful, distinguished panel today, bringing in different perspectives on the issue. But first, I'd like to turn over to Jonathan to say a few opening words on his side.
Great, thanks, Julia. My name is Jonathan Lang. I'm Director for Trade and Supply Chain at Eurasia Group, a geopolitical risk advisory firm founded by Ian Bremmer in 1998. I want to take a moment to thank both the Atlantic Council and Eurasia Group for hosting this important discussion on areas of international collaboration to address supply chain resilience concerns, as well as the new U.S. industrial policy laid out, as Julia mentioned, by National Economic Council Director Brian Deese just yesterday morning. Let me also take a moment to thank our outstanding panel for their participation today. So at Eurasia Group, our industrial and consumer practice works with the private sector to anticipate and adapt to policy change. And given the robust policy agenda Director Deese described, close collaboration between the Biden administration and US companies will be critical for successful implementation of initiatives described. Also critical to address supply chain disruption and longer-term resilience will be collaboration between the United States and international partners, including the European Union. While the administration certainly views these initiatives as a driver of bottom-up and middle-out economic growth, reshoring may not be commercially viable for all sectors, and partner countries will potentially provide a solution to improve short-term resilience as well as long-term value chain security. I also know Europe, as Julia mentioned, is moving down a similar path, taking a look at their own supply chain resilience risks. So I'll be interested to hear more about those points of intersection and collaboration. Needless to say, this is and will continue to be a very active policy space. So with that, let me turn it back over to Julia to move to the panel.
Sure, thank you. Before I do so, we just note to everyone that we'd like to make this as interactive as possible in Zoom land. So please put your questions in the chat function and we'll bring you in as the conversation goes along. We really encourage as active participation as possible. So let me first turn to Maiva to bring in, we've heard, we're the US hosts. So I'd like to first turn to you to give a little bit of perspective on how these conversations are developing in Brussels and sort of what the sort of main components of that are.
Thanks a lot. And first of all, let me really thank you for the invitation. It is indeed a very dynamic landscape, a lot happening in the US, but believe me, also on the European side, we haven't been sitting still. So perhaps I will walk you through our updated industrial strategy And then this allows us, I believe, to have a good conversation on these matters. So in the beginning of May, we published our updated industrial strategy, and it stands basically on 3 pillars or 3 parts. The first one about EU single market, obviously. Secondly, supporting greening and digitalization of industries. And third is about building resilience of EU economy. And this is then by tackling exactly the strategic dependencies and by investments in and funding research and innovation. So let me look at these 3 parts of our work. So first, on the single market. The single market, as we know, is really the main asset of the European Union, with about 400 million consumers, up to 56 million jobs that depend on the trade within the single market. And so with our industry strategy update, we of course see that one of the things we need to do is to strengthen further the free movement of goods, people, services within the EU. And then, of course, also to take lessons from this COVID crisis so that we would be better prepared for any such or different type of crisis in the future. So that's about single market. Now, the second element of our industrial strategy is to really tackle this so-called twin challenge, decarbonization and greening and digitalization. Well, due to the pandemic, EU's GDP declined by something like 6% in 2020. And then last December, EU leaders agreed to really an unprecedented common effort so that we could all emerge stronger out of this pandemic. And you might have seen or noticed that there is this huge package which we title Next Generation EU. And this represents investments in the magnitude of 750 billion euros. And if we then look also that, of course, there is EU normal long-term budget, this together with this Next Generation EU will make really the largest stimulus package that has ever been financed in Europe. So altogether, 1.8 trillion will help us rebuild Europe post-COVID. And of course, this comes on top of sizable national efforts within the European Union. And substantial share of these funds will be dedicated to digital transition and climate investments. And just to take a parallel to the US side, of course, a lot of these funds will go through public procurement. And the tools that I noticed on your side will, of course, be also part of what we do in Europe. And I'm really glad to say that recovery is also already happening here. It's underway. EU economy is forecast to grow by more than 4% this year. And then next year, we hope again for 4.4% growth. Now, beyond the drop of economic activity that we witnessed due to COVID-19, the crisis has certainly exposed the risks linked to this kind of globalized value chain economy that we have been living in so far. And this really brings me to the third pillar of our industry strategy. We realized that we lacked a good understanding of our strategic dependencies, and we also lacked understanding what it really, where we stand with them. So now, as we were going through the update of the industry strategy, we also we made an analysis of our trade dependencies, and we also looked at the more, I would say, future issues of where we are with our strategic capacity building, so investments in research and technologies. And we published this report actually together with other package in May. And indeed, the findings show that trade dependencies are found across economic sectors. Many of them originate in China. And they also show that others are dependent on EU for some products. And of course, we find that we have common dependencies with our trading partners. Some dependencies where, for example, EU and US both are depending on certain supplies from China. So how will we take it forward? In terms of policy measures, we are looking at the mix of actions, which will be then adapted to the needs of various industrial sectors, specific industrial ecosystems, and of course, the risks we have identified. For example, one way of going about it is to build industrial alliances where we bring the various stakeholders and players together. We have now announced new industrial alliances in the areas of semiconductors and cloud, for example. In parallel, we will be, of course, working with international partners to diversify further and strengthen the existing supply chains. We will be looking for also further opportunities for supply chains. And of course, I'm very happy to say that the newly established EU-US Trade and Technology Council really confirms this ambition to go about these matters together and to look into supply chains risks together. And we will also aim at building up domestic capacity in the EU. And this is, of course, particularly important where we see that the options for diversification are limited. And let me give you an area of raw materials. We have, for example, launched a raw materials alliance together with European industry, which brings together something like 500 partner organizations. These are, of course, European, but they are also international. And their idea is, of course, to again look at how to diversify our imports, as well as creating a pipeline for raw material investment projects in Europe. And then maybe my final comment as to the resilience building and tackling the dependencies is about research and innovation. We have just launched a new important research and technology development program. We call it Horizon Europe program. And this brings 95 billion euros for investments and investments in the research and innovation. As an example, under Horizon Europe, we have battery-related research activities, and there substantial amounts of funding in the magnitude of 900 million euros will go for battery development as one of these areas which we have seen has been our dependency and weakness. So thanks a lot. I hope this allows us to have a good conversation.
Thank you, Maeva. And next, why don't we turn to John Murphy of the U.S. Chamber to provide a few minutes of comments on Maeva's comments or on some of the policy activity in the United States. Thanks, and over to you, John.
Thank you, Jonathan. And it's a pleasure to be here today with this group of smart people talking about an important issue. I think I'd like to start by maybe swimming against the tide a little bit here in this conversation. I think our conversation today is going to focus on sectors and products where we've seen strain in supply chains. But I'd like to start with the simple point that actually, in most cases, our supply chains have worked very well through the pandemic, surprisingly well. The share of goods from the perspective of a consumer or a household where we've seen shortages has actually been pretty small. You think back to the first wave of the pandemic here in the United States, further, the goods that you did see shortages like toilet paper or pork or eggs, these were supply chains that are overwhelmingly domestic. And in each case, there was a peculiar story about it. The toilet paper, a lot was made for institutional settings and had to be, manufacturing had to be converted over for COVID cases and meat packing plants. But what we saw, though, was that it was in some cases, it was the domestic supply chains that suffered more strain. And to this day, I was just reading about the furniture maker Room and Board, which has long delays in their orders, but they point out that 90% of their production is domestic. So we shouldn't just assume that geographic diversity in supply chains is a problem. On the contrary, it helps with risk mitigation. Further, I would just point out that the word supply chain makes us think that when there are problems and shortages, that it's a supplier problem. In many cases where we have seen challenges in the past year and a half, it's been because of surges in demand. Nothing particular may have gone wrong necessarily in an industry, but changing consumer preferences, which in some cases change for really obvious and big ways in the pandemic, are the source of it. So think about the auto sector. The auto sector in North America, as the worst of the pandemic hit, projected out into the fall thinking that demand for cars would fall. And perhaps planners didn't necessarily anticipate the dramatic fiscal and monetary response of the US government. And in fact, by the fall, demand for autos was up again in a way that wasn't anticipated. And this has contributed to shortages. No doubt Jimmy can add to this about the semiconductor piece, which has contributed to that. But when we say supply chain problems, sometimes we have to think, though, and stop and remind ourselves that some of it is it's a change in demand. All of this, though, really leads to, I think, an important point. And I do think the administration recognizes this in their 100-day report, or 100-day review that just came out, that what we really need is tailored idiosyncratic solutions to specific problems. So if we have shortages of critical minerals, copper, rare earths, the solutions that we have are not going to be the same that we develop for rubber gloves. Nitrile gloves are in chronic shortage around the world today. 60% of them are made in Malaysia. But you're not going to have a solution that works across all of these products. And I guess my last summary point on that would just be, for that reason, I'm reluctant to use the word industrial policy. It gets people's hackles up. It makes people think of one thing. And what we really see is very different circumstances, even for the four big buckets the administration is talking about: semiconductors, APIs, and generic pharmaceuticals, and so on. Very different solutions. And we need to be smart and recognize that where we've identified problems, we need to tailor those solutions.
Thank you so much. And let's turn to Jimmy again. You have a very specific point of view, I am sure, on on ongoing efforts in Washington, and I'm sure your time as well spent by people like us asking, well, what's the real problem and how do we fix it?
Yeah, well, thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation for me to be here. I'm glad to be with this group and share some of our thoughts about what's happening in the semiconductor industry today. So we're really kind of a unique moment where there's a number of different trends that are aligning. On the one hand, you have the strategic competition between the US and China, where technology is a focus point. And that really has accelerated over the last number of years with the Huawei restrictions, the SMIC restrictions, ZTE, all of it actually ended up being contingent upon Western dominance of semiconductor technology and Chinese weakness. So that, from a supply chain perspective, already highlighted the importance of semiconductor technology. Then after the pandemic, I think policymakers questioned whether or not there are other areas that the United States relies on for its economy, in addition to ventilators and critical personal protective equipment, that may be at risk. And semiconductors were quickly identified as one of those at-risk sectors, because you may be aware that today, nearly 92% of all of our advanced chips are produced in Taiwan. And that has created a lot of anxiety, I think, in particular due to the status of the cross-straits relations today and what they may be like in the future in terms of geopolitical stability. So those two factors were alone already impacting the thinking amongst Washington policymakers about policy and the semiconductor industry. And in fact, before the global chip shortage, there already was introduced a bill in the US Congress last year by Senator Cornyn and Senator Warner called the CHIPS Act to introduce around $15 to $20 billion in grant funding for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. And again, that was about a year and a half ago, and that was primarily targeted at the US vulnerability when it comes to perhaps some over-dependency on parts of East Asia for production in our semiconductor supply chain. However, then last fall, it became apparent that there was now a shortage in semiconductors, and it was brought upon by the pandemic. Actually, if you look back to what happened in the spring of last year, when all the different economies around the world went into lockdown, There were a number of temporary speed bumps in the supply chains. Some semiconductor production facilities in mainland China, Southeast Asia, Mexico, even the United States saw, weeks long or even month long pause in their production. At the same time, we also had the geopolitical tensions between the US and China, where many Chinese customers of semiconductor chips started stockpiling chips in the open market. So inventories prior to all of this was already being dried up. However, as most economies went into lockdown, in particular the auto industry, they forecasted a pretty gloomy outlook through 2020, and they canceled all of their chip orders from their tier one suppliers, from their chip makers, from their foundries, thinking that it's going to be a long time before auto chip demand resumes. It did, though, however, as some economies, for example, the US, started booming back in the fall, and others, demand for new auto purchases skyrocketed in the fall and early last year, but there just weren't enough chips to go around, because what happened in March of 2020 when auto chip orders were canceled, that was just when everyone was going into the stay-at-home, work-from-home economy. So demand for semiconductors across the board was skyrocketing just as they were plummeting for the auto industry. And if you cancel all of your orders, unfortunately, you do go back in line. You have to wait for allocation to happen, as others had already taken a lot of those chip allocation capacity. And those are critical too. iPads that help hospitals work on digital healthcare records, PCs and servers that have power critical infrastructure and financial systems. So it's not like, the auto industry saw their chips deprioritized for something that wasn't just as important. So this then also, I think, created a perfect storm. Again, those geopolitical tensions, the pandemic, cross-strait relations, and now a global chip shortage just painted a picture for policymakers what could happen if something even worse was placed upon the supply chain. In fact, we did a study earlier this year that found that if the US or the global economy was cut off from Taiwan semiconductor production, that alone, the electronics industry will be a $500 billion loss within 12 months. So the discussions here in Washington have accelerated rapidly. We now see the CHIPS Act was included last year in the National Defense Authorization Amendment. It included a provision that creates a domestic grant program for revitalizing semiconductor manufacturing here in the United States, a National Semiconductor Technology Center, in addition to plus-ups for research funding. That was then included in the United States Innovation and Competitiveness Act, because last year that defense authorization didn't actually appropriate any funding. So it was basically just a policy framework. So it was, under the leadership of Senator Schumer, included in the U.S. Innovation Competitiveness Act. President Biden suggested $50 billion in funding for semiconductors in his infrastructure package proposal. And then finally, it was approved by the Senate, and now it's to the House. So we're on the cusp of a pretty historic moment here for our industry. The United States, it's been a long time since we've had this kind of policy support from the federal government. Perhaps the last time were the 1980s in Semitech, and those were much, much smaller levels. But I think it's the right thing to do, because in 1990, the United States produced 37% of semiconductor chips. That's down to 12% today. We do have deep global supply chains that are highly efficient and effective, but I think there is, again, some recognition that we're just a little too exposed to parts of East Asia that, if you think about future US-China competition, just don't necessarily make a lot of sense for us to be so dependent there. And that's really what this legislation, the policy activity, is focused on. So happy to talk in more detail about, again, the chip shortage, the CHIPS Act, what might the outlook be for the industry, but I think that would be helpful context for opening remarks. Back to you.
Thank you. And maybe just while we have you, let's just piggyback and bring in a question from Paul Trillo from the Eurasia Group, asking about the export control restrictions on Huawei and other Chinese firms and how that impacted the shortage crisis. I mean, Jonathan and I were both in the NSC together when this was introduced, right? We started with a punitive approach, and now we're moving on to the Biden plan to revive domestic industry. So maybe just for 2 seconds, export controls in Huawei.
Yeah, well, export controls obviously is a delicate question. National security is important, and that's the role of the government to safeguard our national security interests and those of our allies. And so there has always been a role for export control on dual use sensitive technology that has very explicit military or other sensitive applications. And so, you know, as industry, we completely understand that there are going to be export controls. There have been for decades. However, at the same time, I think from an industry perspective, we need to make sure there's a right balance between making sure our supply chains are efficient and our industrial base is strong versus restricting technology. And if we lean too far on the restriction side, we might upset the cart when it comes to innovation here in the US or exports in our economy. So again, it's all about that balance. I think what we saw last year is when Huawei was first placed on the entity list in 2019, then placed on the foreign direct product rule in May of 2020. There were some gaps between when there were messaging that they were going to be put on the list, when they were actually put on the list. And so as a result of that, Huawei stockpiled significant amounts of semiconductors, and many other Chinese companies too also stockpiled because they were afraid they were next on the list. However, the main driver of the global chip shortage is still the pandemic. There is no doubt that, you know, I'd just say gut feeling 70–80% of what's driving the chip shortage is the pandemic and the supply demand imbalance that was created because of that. But if you layer on the stockpiling done by a lot of Chinese companies, it just exacerbated the situation. So I think, again, you can't single-handedly point out to export controls being the primary driver, but it certainly was more fuel on the fire.
Thank you for that nuance. I think it's important to draw those distinctions, because I think if you read the top line, you might believe that the primary driver is Chinese aggression, economic aggression, right? So let's to keep our ducks in a row here. Maiva, if I can come back to you a little bit, and I think this going back to something we actually said before the conference began when we were chatting. You know, if you review the comments by Brian Deese yesterday, you know, what is your immediate gut reaction and response to, you know, the sort of changing tides in U.S. economic policy, right? Welcome maybe in some quarters of Europe, and certainly not welcome in others, specifically because there is stuff in there on procurement and Buy America and those things that rattle nerves a little bit. So I'd be curious as to your initial thoughts.
Thanks a lot. I think my very first reaction was how surprisingly similar many of the lines of actions are, and yet not exactly the same. There will be also significant differences. So as to the Build Back Better ideas, really investing in infrastructure, supporting businesses by really making sure they can thrive. I think on this line, there is a lot of similarity. And as I already mentioned in my opening remarks, also using really the public sector, public procurement as a way of initiating demand for innovative or decarbonized green products. So all these things where we want the economy to go towards. So that I see a lot of similarity. And I also see similarities in tackling the dependencies, or let's say over dependencies, in the areas which we consider strategic for the development of the economy. So there is a lot of similarity. However, as to Buy America First, so there we see that Europe rather remains a very open, globally also very strongly export-oriented continent. So we don't have a slogan like that. We see that even though we want to build our strategic autonomy stronger than we have maybe focused on it in the many last years, we nevertheless see it as a combination of very strong export orientation and still working with this international system that we have, using WTO and complying with these rules. So that is part of the package. As we talk about open strategic autonomy, which is a balance between trying to build our own capacities, tackling the dependencies, and nevertheless then doing all we also can still to be a partner on the global kind of international value chains which are global. So on this, I would say we have some similarities and some differences. What I also see from the US side, you have substantial targeted public investments. Well, this is what I also mentioned is indeed the case in Europe. And in our case, we are targeting these investments towards greening and decarbonization of the industries, and then digitalization, which of course also is a kind of a key word which covers a lot of various activities from I would say from automation to artificial intelligence. So the digitalization is a bit of a catchword, but there are many things underneath. Thanks.
Thanks, Maeva. And John, turning to you with a quick question on the supply chain disruption task force that was outlined in the report that was issued by the White House following the 100-day supply chain review. So this task force is meant to tackle near-term bottlenecks in the semiconductor, home building, construction, transportation, agriculture, and food industry spaces. You had mentioned kind of the need in your opening remarks for more tailored solutions rather than kind of a one-size-fits-all, and made some comments about logistical hurdles that were encountered during in the midst of the immediate response to the COVID-19 pandemic spread. How do you see your members working with this type of construct, this supply chain disruptions task force? Do you see it as needed? I also note that in her remarks on June 4th, following the issuing of the report, Samira Fasili, who's the Deputy Director of the National Economic Council, noted when asked about supply chain logistics constraints that they were exacerbated by, that may be exacerbating inflationary pressures, that they expect that the bottlenecks will be temporary in nature and resolve themselves over the next few weeks. Considering their projection of a shorter time frame, what do you see the role of this being, this disruption task force? Do you see it kind of scratching that itch of more tailored solutions to identify logistics bottlenecks?
Sure. Well, good question. I think it remains to be seen exactly how this task force will work, but I do think the report gives us a sense of the toolbox that the administration has in mind. And when you listen to Brian Deese's speech yesterday and other comments by administration officials, you do get almost this visual impression of, they're sitting in front of a dashboard with levers and dials and so on. What can they use to address a problem here, a problem there? And I think from the industry perspective, it's useful to sort of look through these one by one. We've talked about geographic diversity of supply as a tool to mitigate risk. I think that's something that inspires a lot of confidence in industry, in many industries, including, for instance, innovative pharmaceuticals. Most of our imports come from Europe, and they're spread across multiple countries. So that provides some assurance there. And indeed, we haven't really had shortages in that sector. In other areas, another example of a quite different tool would be stockpiling. You think about N95 masks. Pandemic preparedness reports going back 25 years have said that the United States needs to stockpile those in advance of a pandemic because you'll never be able to quickly produce enough. And that's been proven true. In the past year and a half, I've spoken a lot with manufacturers of N95s. One of the largest has told me repeatedly that they always made all of them here in the United States. The problem wasn't that it got offshored. The problem was that demand for these products rose 40-fold when the pandemic struck. So you got to be prepared in advance. We had a stockpile. It wasn't nearly big enough. So that's a different tool. Others you hear about maybe inspire a little bit more concern, questions from industry. So for instance, Buy American. Buy American has been in different forms and different laws for decades in the United States. And generally, the use of American-made steel and transportation infrastructure it's the law of the land. It is what it is. It's not disrupting anything. What happens though is when you try to expand these rules into new sectors, and that's what can inspire real difficulty, particularly when you apply it to sophisticated products made on the basis of global supply chains. We saw this in the Recovery Act 10 years ago, where the sectors like the water and wastewater infrastructure sector, if they're using a foreign-made O-ring, They can go over the limit, and suddenly an American company doesn't qualify as American. And we saw lots of delays in those so-called shovel-ready projects. So Buy American expansion can be highly problematic. And it's also just not really, it's not a good tool, not an effective tool to the degree the administration wants to use it to incentivize onshore production of a good. So take generic pharmaceuticals, for instance, which is a major focus of the new report. The federal government purchases about 3 or 4% of the entire US consumption of generic pharmaceuticals. Well, if you talk to the Association for Accessible Medicines and what it would take to get them to manufacture more generic pharmaceuticals here in the United States, they would tell you that it takes $1 billion to build a new plant. It takes 5 to 8 years to build that new plant. And the opportunity to have a preference in selling to the federal government for that little sliver of the US market is just not going to turn the dial. And meanwhile, the challenge with Buy American is that we have international obligations at the WTO, which have been really beneficial to American companies to be able to sell to the EU and to many other markets around the world. I think the administration has been hearing these concerns on Buy American, on some of these other issues, and I think they're quickly fine-tuning their response here to try and figure out what are the right tools for different industries, because some of them won't apply and could do more harm than good.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting to hear your perspective on this as well, in light of Brian Deese's comments yesterday that show a lot of confidence in some of these tools. And so maybe to piggyback on that, if I could ask you a little bit more about your impression about fiscal stimulus and R&D investment and the procyclical nature of these things, right? So with responding to the demand in the economy or current shortages, and the ability for federal resources to get where they need to go in time. And I guess, and maybe Maiva, you can answer that same question, because I know that the 750 billion has not been without criticism in the EU as well.
Sure. Well, the fiscal response, I think, a couple of you mentioned the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act passed by the Senate, and a different version of it is forming in the House, and presumably there'll be a conference report and so on. At the heart of it, in addition to the CHIPS Act funding that Jimmy talked about, there is what was originally the Endless Frontier Act, which is a big boost to basic research funding by the National Science Foundation and a new technology directorate. And the United States has seen cuts for several decades in public spending on basic research. And I think across industry, there's a desire in correcting that. Some of it also for commercialization. That's an area where the US hasn't always done as well. We have world-leading universities, great research, but translating that across into development is a question going forward. But it's not always about the fiscal tools, though, I would think. And maybe just to turn briefly to the critical minerals piece, I would just point out that the administration has ambitious goals on climate, and also ambitious goals in terms of making these new clean technologies in the United States. And sometimes there's a clash between those. So for instance, a lot of these clean technologies are going to depend on copper, cobalt, and rare earths. But the United States is not, we haven't opened new mines in this country in many years. It's estimated that global mining firms are going to have to increase their production of critical minerals by 500% by 2030 to meet these clean technology goals. But it takes, on average, I was just reading this in The Economist, 16 years to approve the average global mining project, often longer in the United States. So it's not about the funding, it's about permitting and environmental rules and so on. And I think that in some of these areas, particularly in the clean technology sector, the question is, how are you going to reconcile these goals, climate goals and the Make It in America goals? And are you going to be able to issue permits for mines to do that?
Yeah, thanks, John. And just to quickly piggyback on those comments on critical minerals, mining and refining, obviously, as noted, there's certainly supply chain risk just given the centrality of the Chinese market, particularly in the refining capacity for a number of rare earths and critical minerals. But as you noted, there's a policy tension that exists between kind of expanding that capacity, certainly domestically, but also internationally, and then broader climate policy goals. So maybe to Maeva, could you provide some quick thoughts on how that's viewed, that tension is viewed from the European perspective, and what conversations have been like with international partners to try to resolve some of those longstanding mining and refining capacity issues?
Thanks a lot. This is really a hot topic, but maybe I'll actually begin the response from a bit further away, because I would like to also highlight that what we see as the disruptions in the supply chains are, of course, due to pandemic, and in some areas due to the stockpiling of these goods or raw material. But certainly we have seen this trend, particularly for raw materials. The trend has been there already for years. So it's just that it's now becoming more acute. And as to the EU response, in fact, already in 2018, we identified about 30 so-called critical raw materials, which are critically important for achieving our climate and digitalization goals. So these are exactly as we just discussed here, the copper and cobalt and other such raw materials, which are essential for the digital industry or digitalization, but they are absolutely needed also for the green transition from wind turbines to other technologies. So already then we identified that in 30 raw material classes, so to say, raw materials, we do not have enough. And we see that they are critical because either we don't have enough and we are very much dependent on just one or very limited number of countries where we can import. Or secondly, where we see that, for example, like lithium, which is not, a rare earth. I mean, this lithium is available in many places, but the demand is expected to go beyond 50 times of what we have used so far. So, such a jump in demand certainly has an impact also on the availability of these deliveries. So we have put it on our policymakers, so to say, radar screen now about 3 years ago. And this was the driving factor why the so-called European Raw Materials Alliance was called, and where we now have this more than 500 players around this alliance. So what does it bring? So I wanted to also underline that the role of public services or public support here is not only by bringing money. I mean, money is important, of course, and if we want to rejuvenate any of the mines in Europe or build our capacities for processing of any of these critical raw materials, of course we need funding for that. But beyond that, I think what we see now through this work with the industry alliances, the so-called convening power of the European Union in our case, really seems to have an impact as well, that we bring the various kind of stakeholders together and facilitate this process. And this also goes towards the permitting processes, which also are too long. They vary from country to country, but they tend to be too long. And as you just quoted, the same here, in kind of on an average, 15 years can easily go for mining permits, which is of course a long time if we think of the competition that we're currently facing. But maybe to give also one or two examples how the public funding and this type of measures can help. One area where we have very concrete results is battery production, where just, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago, less than 1% of batteries were produced in Europe. So we were nowhere pretty much. But seeing, of course, the forthcoming revolution in the automobile industry, So about 3 years ago, this battery alliance was created, and this has mobilized these sectors, and this has really mobilized also a lot of investments, private investments, not only public investments. So now we're talking about 70 projects, large-scale projects, new factories in various parts of Europe, and we are on a good track to become really a major producer of these batteries. Another example, I would say a bit of a negative example, is on the PV panels. Europe used to be a stronghold of solar panels, and we were a first mover in many ways. But then we perhaps didn't invest enough. And today, I would say about 8 out of 10 panels invested in 8 out of 10 panels installed in Europe tends to be from China. And there also then the research has not kept up. So this we see as maybe an area which would need some attention. Similarly, as I mentioned before, cloud, where the share of total revenues that currently is generated in Europe is maybe in the magnitude of 1% only. So we see that we need to keep an eye on these trends, and not only the current dependencies which have already manifested themselves. Because as we go towards decarbonization of the industries, the needs will change. So we want to be a bit ahead of the curve. And indeed, the discussion how to really make it work is not an easy one. It's politically quite loaded. Also in Europe, people are not very fond of mines. So one of the responses that we put on the table is that in Europe, we have stepped up our requirements for sustainable, environmentally friendly, and also socially sustainable mining. And we have really asked our industries to raise the bar on these questions. And this helps then also to generate the necessary social acceptance around it.
Thank you, Maeva. That was an important insight. Turning to Jimmy with a quick question. Getting a number of questions in the chat panel on international investment in semiconductors, and then also the role that investment screening can play in those activities. So, I mean, as you noted, there's a significant concentration of advanced chip manufacturing in East Asia, certainly between Taiwan, Korea, and South Korea. Right now, both the United States and the European Union are trying to solicit investment for kind of bringing some of that manufacturing capacity to the United States and Europe. What role will the investment screening process play in that? And then also considering that both the United States and Europe and others are somewhat fishing from the same pond in terms of trying to relocate some of that manufacturing capacity outside of those two countries, outside of South Korea and Taiwan. How does international cooperation on that supply chain diversification play, considering the fact that we're fishing from the same pond, so to speak?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think in the past, when we thought about investment screening, that was primarily around Chinese attempts to acquire foreign semiconductor assets. And from 2015 to roughly 18, we saw a lot of activity from Chinese government-backed industrial, quote, guidance funds to acquire foreign chip firms. CFIUS, even in the Obama era, was pretty active, carried through Trump. And even in Europe, we saw Italy recently block a deal, South Korea as well. So I think overall, it's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for Chinese headquartered firms to acquire foreign semiconductor assets. So I think that's kind of one separate topic. However, when you think about foreign direct investment more in the greenfield space, particularly as it relates to non-Chinese entities, I think we actually see a high degree of receptivity from a lot of different geopolitical regions and countries. And that's because, as you point out, a lot of that chip competency, particularly in advanced node manufacturing, you heard of TSMC and Samsung, they're the leaders. And while Intel is behind and they may catch up, it may take a few years. So in the short term, those are the two firms that, everyone from presidents to prime ministers are trying to court to build in their country. TSMC and Samsung have both committed to build fabs in the United States. That's an important contribution to the vitality of our semiconductor manufacturing sector. US fabless design firms have about 70% of the market, and currently TSMC and Samsung are the only two providers that can build chips for them below 10 nanometers. Hopefully Intel will be competitive and they can be part of that solution, but it's going to take some time. So for the United States, it's kind of a no-brainer that they need to welcome that investment here, in addition to making domestic firms competitive. Japan now also trying to lure foreign investment because they recognize their domestic firms don't have that capability. Europe too, also thinking about what they can do to entice one of those Taiwanese or Korean firms to build a foundry in their border. So if you're the CEO or chairman of a global foundry company right now, you're getting phone calls from presidents saying, please build in my backyard. And the challenge we have is, how do we ensure that with all of this new renewed government support, how do we make sure that the market still at the end of the day is going to be the driving factor? And we're confident that it will be. You hear some astronomical numbers, 50 billion here, 20 billion here, but it's important to put that in context. The global chip industry alone in 2019 spent around $70 billion on capital expenditures. TSMC is going to spend on its own, without government money, nearly 100 billion over the next 3 years. The Korean industry over the next 10 years is projected to spend 450 billion. So as a percentage of global capital expenditure, the government support levels are still very small, around the 10-15% level. And that means that 85 to 75% of the risk is still going to be undertaken by private industry, private capital. And I think that's important because it means at the end of the day, CEOs are going to be making their capital and fab construction decisions based upon the market, not government demand. On the opposite end, you see China, where the government owns or controls about half of the equity in their entire industry. They operate most of the companies directly, and so they don't have to respond to those market signals, and they have far less risk than the foreign multinationals have. So we do see some risks longer term from that approach in China to the health of the industry.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's also, again, drawing the distinction between sort of restrictive, punitive, or government investment, right? Going back to that sort of careful balance that you noted before. I'd like to turn to a question from one of our senior fellows at the Geoeconomic Center, Nicole Golden. And she asks, she says that SMEs dominate the formal and informal employment landscape in most countries. This is critical to growth and inclusive recovery. So why aren't they part of the bigger supply chain conversation? Should and how can they be? So that part, maybe I'll add a little bit of my own color on this, and turn to you, John. How much do you see the Biden plan or congressional legislation specifically targeting smaller businesses in the United States, or do you foresee that larger industry and multinationals will profit from it?
Well, it's a great question, but I think it calls out that folks across the span of supply chains don't always see the other parts. Take the aerospace sector. So large companies like Boeing, like GE, which makes jet engines, and others, they each have 10 to 20,000 small and medium-sized enterprises that are suppliers to them. And Airbus would say the same thing, which is also a transatlantic company that manufactures in the United States, and it's highly integrated, and it goes down multiple layers. And I remember meeting an aerospace component manufacturer from Arkansas that was not even aware that all of its goods, which went to a mid-tier manufacturer in Kansas and then were put into Boeing planes. This company was not even aware of the degree to which its production was majority exported, because this is such a global industry. So I think that's a dynamic that you see from time to time. They don't necessarily, smaller and medium-sized manufacturers don't always appreciate the degree to which that they may be dependent on these global supply chains and on global markets. So they're often in there. And I'm not sure, I do think that there's a lot of emphasis on supply chain transparency right now, and you see this around issues like forced labor. There's news in the past couple of days on new withhold release orders on polysilicon from certain companies in China out of concern about forced labor in those enterprises. I think that increasingly governments are going to be pushing on companies to understand their supply chains better. And in some sectors, in some industries, that's easy, and others it's hard. It's a big world. Supply chains are extremely complex. As I hinted at the beginning, I don't really like the term supply chain. It gives this image of something that's really tightly bound. It's more of an ecosystem or a network. And, people like to, I think the man on the street may think that these things are always very well understood by, the OEM of the major multinational that he or she sees all the way through down to the bottom of their sourcing. And maybe they can just use blockchain and it'll all be easy. And that's not really the free market trading world that we live in for every sector. Obviously, it's changing. Companies recognize that they need to see this stuff better. There's reputational risks, legal risk, but that's something that companies are going to be wrestling with more and more in the future.
Thanks, John. And turning to a topic which both Director Deese yesterday commented on, as well as is defined to some degree in the report released by the White House after the conclusion of the 100-day supply chain review. And these are generally on trade topics. So one being the construct of the new trade strike force led by USTR, and then also the renewed interest in a possible expansion of the use of Section 232 tariffs, particular to neodymium. And this could be opened up to thoughts from both Maeva and John. But I know certainly on the heels of the conversations with the US-EU summit and progress made on resolving existing bilateral trade tensions, certainly around the Boeing Airbus deal, been making some progress on the transatlantic front. John, I know that early in the process of the supply chain review, your colleague Chris Roberti put out a statement that said, in part, the Chamber trusts the administration will engage closely with the private sector, and then also reject punitive approaches or new trade barriers to implementing some of their initiatives. I just wanted to get both of your thoughts on these particular recommendations. Maeva, certainly to you. Do you see the activity of what will be the trade strike force, and then also a possible expansion of 232 scope as a new trade irritant that might, depending upon how they would be employed, be a barrier to transatlantic cooperation on supply chain resilience? And John, certainly to you on your colleagues' comments on the use of new, more punitive trade tools. Invite your thoughts on these as well. And first, Maeva, did you want to provide comments?
Yeah, why not? Let me begin. Actually, I wanted to also comment on the previous point on SMEs and the supply chains, and then I come to your question. I actually wanted to say that in Europe, we are now looking at our economy and how the industries function exactly through the so-called industrial ecosystem lens, because we understand that it's not kind of a neat kind of a chain which just goes nicely from one to another. It is a complex landscape, and the SMEs are very much part of this landscape. So we do take due care of bringing these smaller businesses also to the policy dialogue with the Commission. We have created an industry forum where the smaller businesses are represented also, so that we are not only talking to the larger businesses. Plus, of course, they are part of everywhere in the ecosystems which receive public attention. But maybe further interesting point is about this global supply chain and the forced labor issues. European Commission is preparing a piece of legislation. We have an initiative under preparation which would be addressing it, and we call it due diligence, basically a requirement, which would be exactly looking at how the various raw materials or products are actually produced, whether the environmental conditions are acceptable, and of course the social issues as well. So very likely this is going to come also this year, and we'll be looking exactly in this direction that we just discussed. Now, whether what is called now the trade strike force and the other measures, how they will exactly work out, well, let's first see what they will contain. I certainly believe that it is in both of our interests, the US side and the European side, to be working together in good collaboration. We have many shared interests. Well, in some fields, we have just managed to solve also for solve some long-standing, let's say, debates and thorny issues. We have all the interest to collaborate together. On the EU side, we have also recently updated our trade policy, and the updated trade policy is very much emphasizing the need to reinforce actually what we have, the various clauses we have in our free trade agreements. So we also see the need to put more teeth to what we have agreed to, so that the policy is not, sometimes a nice declaration of will, but it has to be also then reinforced exactly. But looking forward to what the new administration initiatives will bring.
Well, just to add on there, trade strike force, I suppose it sounds a little more exciting than the Trade Policy Staff Committee, which has existed for years, which the USTR chairs. It's an interagency committee for preparation of trade policy across the administration, where different agencies have their own equities. So it remains to be seen what exactly that's going to mean in practice. But in terms of the threat of new trade barriers, certainly that's something that we're going to be on the lookout for. I think we've seen in the past 18 months that when barriers to trade have come up, they have hurt and not helped in the economic recovery. There was early in the pandemic an expansion of the use of export restrictions by multiple countries. In many cases, they backed off pretty quickly because governments saw that they were not helpful. And I do think that the administration, again, there's signs that I think they appreciate this when it comes to Buy American, which can be a kind of a trade barrier. This is an administration that has a lot to say about Buy American, emphasizes it heavily. You see this in executive orders. There's a new post in the OMB, the head of a Made in America office. But these structures have not necessarily done very much yet. It remains to be seen what the actions are. And I would just point to one action. The Biden administration did drop an initiative they inherited from the Trump administration. It's actually a Peter Navarro initiative to drop U.S. coverage of medical goods in our government procurement obligations. It was a very bad idea that Peter Navarro had prepared there. It would have hurt U.S. industry a lot more than it would have helped. And the administration walked away from that protectionist proposal, which was pending at the WTO in Geneva. So I'm heartened that the administration is listening to industry on these things, and we're going to continue to engage.
Thank you for that. We're quickly turning into a pumpkin here, and we lost Jimmy to his next meeting. But just to close out, John and then Maeva, so what are the top one or two things that you would like to see happen within the next 1 or 2 months?
That's a good question. So hope to see continued engagement with the private sector on a sector by sector basis. This 100-day review addressed 4 major sectoral areas, but there's a year-long review underway that's more far-reaching with different agencies, including the Defense Department, agriculture, energy, that's going to go deeper. So we hope that we'll continue to see open engagement on this. I hope that there will continue to be a circumspect approach to the use of these different policy tools, some of which are actually inspire confidence, such as efforts to boost geographic diversity by working more closely with allies. It's a general theme that has a lot of support in industry. But we hope to see more hard questions asked about the possibility of using, for instance, the Defense Production Act, which doesn't have a long modern track record. It was used in vaccine production with priority orders being applied for many critical inputs. But the idea that we're going to be using those authorities from a law that was really designed to help building tanks and ammunition back around several decades ago, to see that applied more broadly, I think there's a lot of questions about how that would work, for instance. So we hope to have that kind of ongoing dialogue about the tools.
For me, there are really two things. I would say the biggest thing is that we are at the final stretch of producing a major political package on getting the EU ready for cutting 55% of the greenhouse gases. And that is a major package, comes in middle of summer, middle of July. And this will have a major impact on our own industries. And I think also it will have impact on the way how we are, a global player, from the emission trading system to carbon border adjustment mechanism and the energy taxation. So there are many things in there. And this is a big package we are currently busy with. And for me, the second one is indeed the many initiatives that we have announced under the industry policy updates, where, among other things, we also want to continue now really setting a more regular overview of the various dependencies and how we should monitor it and how we should really put measures in place to tackle them. So this work will also continue, and we are about to have a kind of a second wave of analysis prepared as well, similar like you do in the US side. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we've run a few minutes over. I think that attests to the complexity and the multifaceted nature of this conversation, going anything from domestic growth to supply chain security to defensive instruments. Again, all of these themes are spinning around in one pot. And so I think going back to what you said, John, about the instruments and the tools and exactly how we use them, and Maeva putting meat on the bones. So just thank you so much to the two of you, and also to Jimmy, who's departed, and thank you so much to Jonathan for working with me on this from his new seat at the Eurasia Group. We look forward to continuing this conversation. Please check out also Brian Deese's comments yesterday. If you haven't already, they certainly spark conversation. So once again, thank you so much, everybody, and have a good afternoon and evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.